De pestifera doctrina retahentium homines a religionis ingressa, which could be loosely translated, all about the pestilential doctrine put forward by retrogrades who wish to drag us all back into the Dark Ages. Perhaps, as a result of its catchy title, this treatise soon became a bestseller throughout the Latin Quarter, and Aquinas carried the day. In 1272, Aquinas returned to Italy and took up a teaching post at his alma mater in Naples. Here he continued to work on his second magnum opus, Summa Theologica, an attempt to bring together all the separate elements of his thought into a comprehensive philosophical system. This system was intended to include all the moral, intellectual, and theological thought of the Catholic Church. Although this work remained incomplete at Aquinas' death, it is still considered the finest and most complete exposition of the medieval mind. Sadly, a somewhat hollow achievement in modern eyes. Aquinas' masterpiece attracts virtually no interest today, except among Catholics who have to study it because it contains the truth about philosophy. The tone is set when Aquinas gives no less than 5 proofs for the existence of God. Modern readers may wonder why, if one is not enough, 4 more will do the trick any better. Other topics which have ensured Aquinas' masterpiece the slimmest chance of entering the bestseller lists include discussions of the following: what the world will be like after judgment, whether weakness, ignorance, malice, and lust are the result of sin, and whether the movement of the heavenly bodies will cease after Judgment Day. You may find it difficult to believe that even during the medieval era people were able to summon great enthusiasm for such topics, accompanied as they were by Aquinas' copious dissertations on their pros and cons, together with ample quotations from the philosopher, Aristotle, and other long-dead authorities. But you would be wrong. During this period, vast numbers of monasteries were scattered throughout the length and breadth of Europe, many in extremely remote locations. Within the confines of these so-called abstemious and celibate institutions, the lower orders did most of the turnip-picking and beer-tasting, leaving the intellectuals to combat the disease that reached epidemic proportions throughout monastic Europe, namely axidy, often known as the sickness of monks, better known to us as stupefying apathy or sloth. Under such circumstances, Aquinas' long and earnest discussions on whether the body is commanded by the soul in irrational animals, the bodily condition and identity of those who rise again after death, and whether we should love our body out of charity, must indeed have proved riveting topics. Fortunately, Aquinas was interested in writing something more than Christianity's answer to the Talmud. Amidst all the rabbinical nitpicking, there are passages which reveal a mind in a class of its own, whose thought is way ahead of its time. Take, for instance, Aquinas' discussion of whether pain or sorrow is assuaged by every pleasure. He begins by quoting the philosopher. Sorrow is driven out by pleasure, either by a contrary pleasure or by any other, as long as it is intense. Aquinas then argues, pleasure is a kind of repose of the appetite in a suitable good, while sorrow arises from something unsuited to the appetite. He concludes, in a passage whose slightly outdated approach should not be allowed to obscure its insight, a person can find himself filled with sadness when he takes part in some pleasant activity which he used to share with a friend who is now absent or dead. Under such circumstances, there are 2 causes within him which produce contradictory effects. The thought of his friend's absence causes sorrow to well up in him. On the other hand, his life in the immediate present, participating in pleasant activity, is a cause of pleasure. Each of these causes in some way modifies the other, but our perception of the present is stronger than our memory of the past. Also, our love of self is more persistent than our love for another. Thus, in the end, our pleasure drives out our sorrow. Here, Aquinas reveals psychological acumen while miraculously remaining within an orthodox religious standpoint, which also agrees with his Aristotelian philosophy. Writing insightful psychology is difficult enough, especially in the language of a pre-psychological era. Writing psychology, which is at the same time also theology and philosophy, is a major intellectual juggling trick. This brings us to Aquinas' moral philosophy. Once again he adopts the common-sense Aristotelian approach. Aristotle and Aquinas saw human happiness as the goal of all in this life. Sailing through life with this attitude may carry one perilously close to the reefs of unorthodoxy and even heresy, though Aquinas had sufficient skill and psychological acumen to disguise this awkward fact. The aim of moral philosophy was to delineate how this happiness could be achieved in a moral fashion for the individual, the family, and society. Such happiness, said Aquinas, was achieved by way of the natural law which was discovered by reason. This natural law could also be rejected, thus making immoral behavior irrational and unnatural. As we have already seen, unreasonable behavior is usually adopted for selfish reasons when we have a mistaken, short-sighted idea of happiness, for example, murder, greed, or sloth. Aquinas sets out 4 cardinal virtues which assist us in achieving moral goodness. These are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. Of these, the major virtue is prudence. To modernize, this may appear a somewhat vague, prissy concept, the element of discreet discernment in action. The actual Latin word Aquinas uses is prudentia. This is a stronger notion, with connotations of wisdom, foresight, and skill, both social and intellectual. Yet it remains somewhat vague as a guideline. Aquinas appears to mean that we should cultivate in ourselves a suitable perception which enables us to come out on the side of the morally good. This may seem to us little more than pick the winner, ethically speaking, of course. But we live in uncertain times when the ethical field has many runners. In Aquinas' day this was a one-horse race. The Church was the invariable winner. The vagueness in his concept of prudence simply allowed for slight shifts in the Church's position on moral matters. For more than a year, Aquinas continued lecturing at the University of Naples, working on his Summa Theologica and overworking on his usual prolific production of treatises, commentaries, sermons, works of exegesis, and the like. Then, in the autumn of 1273, while working late one night in his cell, he had a mystical experience. In the midst of this, he saw a vision of the truth and the joy of life everlasting. Afterward he gave up writing and became more solitary, explaining that all his intellectual arguments now seemed like mere chaff in the wind. As winter drew on, he became ill. Although he was only 50, years of overwork and absent-minded frugal living had taken their toll on even his robust frame. Aquinas now had only a few months to live. In the new year, a summons arrived from Pope Gregory X demanding Aquinas' presence at the Second Council of Lyons. This had been called in yet another attempt to heal the doctrinal rift between the Roman and the Byzantine churches. Aquinas was needed to explain the finer points of how their irreconcilable differences could still theoretically be overcome. Heedless of his illness, Aquinas set off on the 600-mile journey, which he was never to complete. By now he was barely aware of his surroundings. But as he journeyed north on the road from Naples, he found himself dimly recognizing the landscape around Aquino. On the hill across the valley, above the village of Roccasecca, he made out the familiar silhouette of the castle, where he was born in 1225. Afterward. The philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, later known as Thomism, was quickly adopted wholesale by the Church. His works were consulted on doctrinal problems, and his philosophy became the ultimate intellectual authority. The Pope, of course, remained the ultimate actual authority, but his decrees usually had little intellectual content. This had a stifling effect on philosophical thought, which was reduced to mere quibblings about what Aristotle and Aquinas had actually meant. Commentary and exegesis were the order of the day, and original philosophy remained stone dead. It's arguable that this had in fact been the case since the death of St. Augustine, almost 800 years before Aquinas arrived on the scene. This outlook continued after the death of Aquinas and for the 2 remaining centuries of the medieval era. Astonishingly, it then persisted during the Renaissance, when the mindset of European civilization changed beyond recognition. The earth and the Roman Catholic Church were dislodged from the center of the universe. Science and humanism held sway, inspiring an intellectual self-confidence that enabled Europeans to circumnavigate the globe and redraw the map of the heavens. Yet philosophy remained unaffected, with Thomism continuing to be taught in the universities, and the world of speculation caught in a 2,000-year-old Aristotelian time warp. Not until the 17th century did the first cracks begin to appear in this vast Gothic structure, upon which more concerted labour